Good morning and welcome to the Whiteshell Laboratories webinar. We'll just give a few minutes for people to filter in and then we'll get started. All righty. All right, so welcome to the webinar on the Whiteshell Laboratories Closure Project. Today's webinar, we're focusing on an overview of the environmental protection program at the Whiteshell Laboratories. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge that the Whiteshell Laboratories site is located on Treaty 1 and Treaty 3 lands. They're traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dene, Dakota, and Oji-Cree nations, and the homeland of the Métis. Hi, my name's Mitch McKay. I'm the manager of stakeholder relations, CNL's Environmental Remediation Management Group. I'm joined today by several colleagues from the Whiteshell site, and I will introduce them in just a moment. But first, I'll go over some of the logistics of today's webinar. So once again, thank you for joining us. This webinar will be roughly 1 hour and will include 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer period. Now, this question and answer period will be strictly within the scope of the presentation today, so we're focused on the Whiteshell Environmental Protection Program. If you do have questions that are outside the scope of this presentation today, we'd be happy to answer them, but not during today's webinar. We'll take your question and happily give you a reply at a later date. If you do come up with something later after the presentation or just in general that you've got a question or you want more information on, you can always contact us at ermstakeholder@cnl.ca, and we'd be happy to put that email address in the chat function as well, so you're able to do that. This webinar is available in both French and English, and you can access that by going down to the bottom of the Zoom platform and to your right, and you'll see an icon that looks like a globe, and it says interpretation. By clicking on that globe interpretation icon, you can access either French or English version of this webinar today. Please note the French does have a slight lag. As well, at the bottom, you'll see there's a Q&A icon. Looks like, well, there's Q and an A, and that is to the bottom left, and that is where you can type your questions in for the webinar today. Any and all questions you can put in there, and I will help facilitate the answer towards the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel in the next few days in both official languages. So you are able to go back and look at it or share it with others as you see fit, as it will be on our YouTube channel in the next couple days. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Leslie Wilson to introduce herself and her colleagues on the line with us today. Leslie, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Mitch. Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Wilson, and I work as an environmental specialist here at Whiteshell. I primarily do environmental management system work and some compliance work, and also work on our biodiversity monitoring. So, and who will also have online today is Ryan Belinsky. So he's our Environmental Protection Program Manager. And he's going to take us through, or take you guys through, all of the monitoring activities that we do on site, just so you get a general idea of what goes on here for environmental protection at Whiteshell. I'm just going to stop my video to put up my presentation. Just bear with me, that's coming up. Mitch, just a quick test. Can you see my PowerPoint screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect.
You just got the question and answer panel open from the Zoom. You can just, oh, no, that's me.
Oh, that's you, okay. Okay, perfect.
It's all good.
That's great. Okay, well, just first for some of you that aren't as familiar with the site, so we're about 100 kilometers northeast of Winnipeg. We're really close to the town of Pinawa. So the turnoff for our site is on Highway 211, indicated with a star there on your screen. And a lot of people aren't aware of this, but our site is actually located on just over 4,300 hectares of land. So that's quite an expansive land. And I've just outlined our property in pink that you'll see on the screen there. As Mitch had mentioned, we're operating on Treaty 3 territory. So that's the traditional land of the Ojibwa and Saulteaux people, as well as Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, Dene, and Dakota people. And we're also on the lands of the traditional lands of the Métis people as well. The nearby communities are, we have Lac du Bonnet is the major town downstream, and Seven Sisters and Pinawa upstream of the site. So pretty much the Winnipeg River forms the western boundary of the main Whiteshell site, and the site's located in a larger boreal shield ecozone, or the Lake of the Woods ecoregion and the Stead Eco District. The site is primarily tree covered. Actually, there's small areas of our site, the main campus and the waste management area, where you won't find too many trees. But in the large expanse, we're about 83% tree cover of the total area. And a large area on our site, about 52%, is complex bog, fen, and swamp wetlands. So we always want to stay out of those areas when we're operating and protect those areas. But just a brief history, a brief little introduction to Whiteshell. So Whiteshell Laboratories operated from 1961 to 1997 as a research and testing facility. And at that time, all the research that happened on the site led to reactor design improvements, analytical equipment, and waste management techniques, as well as a commercialization of several industrial applications for nuclear safeguarding technologies. And then there was also quite a bit of environmental research done on the site. But a decision was made that the research would cease and the site would be decommissioned. So right now, today we operate under what's called the Comprehensive Study Report, which is basically a general plan laid out under the environmental assessment that was approved by the federal government to fully decommission the site. And our environmental protection program is just one of the compliance programs on site. So we provide a lot of oversight to decommissioning and operation activities. And as Ryan will talk about coming up, we do quite a bit of monitoring on the site. Yeah, and we're an ISO 14001 site. We have been for a number of years. We share this registration with an operating nuclear facility just outside of Ottawa, Chalk River Laboratories. And ISO 14001, it doesn't really resonate with many people. They're like, okay, what's that? It sounds like some kind of standard. It's basically an international standard for environmental management systems. And our environmental protection program is built on the foundation of this international standard of ISO 14001. So basically that registration covers the operation of nuclear and non-nuclear facilities on our site, decommissioning projects and demolition, and waste management activities on the site. And we're basically continually audited against this standard by both internal and external auditors. The key to the program is continual improvement. So that's the key to our environmental protection program, is continuing to improve as we move through the decommissioning project here at Whiteshell. I also wanted to share this with you before I hand it over to Ryan. Part of our ISO 14001 certification is sustainability. That's getting more and more important to business as we move along. We just started maybe about a year ago a sustainable leadership committee. 2 participants from Whiteshell are on that committee, and that's a company-wide initiative. And I put up on the screen along the left-hand side some of the focus areas that we have for sustainability, again, company-wide, so across Canada. And one of the things that we've been doing quite a bit of over the years to support sustainability is some sustainable environmental objectives. So some of the examples of things that we do on the site are a small energy reduction campaign, environmental communication projects. We did an office waste reduction project, compost feasibility study, barn swallow habitat project. And this past year, we did a tree planting campaign. We supported a tree planting campaign this year. So there's some projects like that that we have going on. And the other aspect is new to our company is the Global Reporting Initiative. So we're reporting more on energy use, water use, emissions, and waste reduction on the site. So with that, I'll just hand it over to Ryan Belinsky, our Environmental Protection Program Manager, and he'll take you through our monitoring programs.
Thank you, Leslie. I'll begin by diving deep into our environmental protection program that we currently have at the Whiteshell site. Whiteshell has an integrated environmental monitoring program that encompasses 3 major components. We have an effluent verification monitoring plan, an environmental monitoring plan, and a groundwater monitoring plan. And when I say that we have an integrated environmental protection program, what that really means is that when we notice an impact in one portion of the program, it's going to have an effect further down the road in another part of the program. For example, if we notice that there is an increase in some of the contaminants in the effluent that we release into the Winnipeg River, for example, we will be on the lookout to see if those contaminants are being detected in our environmental monitoring program, whether or not they're being noticed in the garden crops that are cultivated along the Winnipeg River or in the fish that are caught from the Winnipeg River. Just to give you an idea how a small impact in one part of the program will have an effect further down the line in our monitoring program. Going on to the effluent verification monitoring program in greater detail. This program is based on the CSA standard N288.5. We primarily focus on the liquid and air emissions coming from the various facilities on our site. If we go on to the next slide, or the next couple of slides, we'll see a figure depicting our major sources of liquid effluent emissions. The two sources that discharge liquid effluent directly into the Winnipeg River are highlighted in blue in this figure. There are Lagoon system, which collects all the domestic waste generated on our site, in addition to the laundry effluent that we produce on site. The primary purpose of the lagoon is to provide an opportunity for the contaminants to settle in our holding cells and allow them to break down by biological processes prior to being released into the Winnipeg River. The other major source of effluent on our site that goes directly to the Winnipeg River is our outfall monitoring station. This location collects all the processed water and stormwater generated from the main campus, and it provides the last opportunity to monitor prior to being released into the Winnipeg River. If you notice on the figure, the two yellow boxes highlighting building 100 and building 300 focus on upstream monitoring locations. This is our processed water that's being created or generated from building 100 would be the WR1 reactor building, and building 300 would be our hot cells, shielded facilities, decontamination center, and environmental labs. Each of those buildings has a low-level liquid waste treatment system that will be collecting all the processed water that is being generated from the facility, and not only the processed water, but also the groundwater collected by the sumps. This water then gets analyzed prior to being released. If it meets all the release criteria, it will go on to the outfall monitoring station. And if it doesn't meet the criteria, we'll attempt to treat the effluent. And if we're unable to treat the effluent with our treatment system, we will tote it and then send it off for alternative waste disposal methods. So the types of parameters that we monitor for in our liquid effluent, beginning with the radiological parameters, we're on the lookout for gross alpha radioactivity and gross beta activity. This will give us a general idea of the total amount of radioactivity being generated from our site operations. From there, we'll try to identify the radioactive isotopes responsible for the activity through gamma spectrometry, and any of the activity balance that we can't explain through gamma spec, we will then be submitting the samples for additional analysis. Typically it's strontium and plutonium to account for any of the gross beta activity or gross alpha activity that we can't explain for at the moment. The major sources of the gross beta radioactivity would be the strontium-90 isotope, cesium-137, and tritium on our site. For the gross alpha, our primary culprit is naturally occurring uranium, but there is also americium-241. Going on to the non-radiological parameters that we measure our effluent for, just your basic field parameters, pH and conductivity are the first ones that we look at. But in addition to that, we are also looking at total suspended solids, oil and grease, the various metals, and phosphorus. With our lagoon, there's some also additional parameters that we're looking for. Microbial counts, total E. coli, total fecal coliforms, and then there's also biological oxygen demand and total residual chlorine being looked at. Next slide. In this slide, you can see the derived regulatory limit. It's highlighted with the red bar going across the graph. And then if you notice at the bottom of the graph, that's our emissions, our liquid emissions from a radioactive perspective that we're emitting into the environment. You can see we're quite a bit lower than our regulatory limit. We're not even 1% of what we're permitted to release into the environment. This slide captures some of the recent improvements that we have done to our liquid effluent. We've changed the chemicals being used in our laundry facility over the last number of years. We've gone to phosphate-free detergents. Our cleaning staff is trying to use chlorine-free products as well. This will impact or help the effluent being generated in the lagoon to ensure that we're meeting our regulatory discharging criteria. We've also diverted the laundry effluent to the lagoon. It used to have a direct pathway to the outfall monitoring station. However, we're now sending it to the lagoon. This is enabling a lot of particulate to settle to the bottom of the lagoon, and we've noticed an improvement in our total suspended solid numbers being generated from our site. There was also in 2021 a liquid discharge study evaluating all the various facilities and structures that have the potential to discharge any effluent into the Winnipeg River. And we're currently in the process of implementing some of the recommendations that have resulted from this study. This is just a demonstration of our ISO 14001 goal of continuously improving our environmental monitoring program. Going on to the air emissions that are being generated from our site. You'll notice in the next slide, there's 3 buildings that are highlighted. I've already spoken to Building 100, which houses the WR1 reactor, and Building 300 are hot cells and shielded facilities. The other building that we used to actively monitor for air emissions is Building 200. It used to be the site of our centralized active liquid waste treatment center. In the name of decommissioning, we've gone away from a centralized system to more localized systems in Building 100 and Building 300 to enable the decommissioning process. Building 200, our site has been working on prepping that for decommissioning over the last few years. And in fact, the actual building structure came down this calendar year. In regards to the parameters that we're looking for in the air emissions, from a radioactive perspective, we're primarily focused on the gross alpha and gross beta radioactivity. And again, we use gamma spectrometry to identify the radioactive isotopes responsible for the gross alpha and gross beta activity being observed. From a non-radiological perspective, especially when we're demolishing buildings, we're on the lookout for total suspended particulate and particulate less than 2.5 microns. In addition to that, I know our site is also monitoring the amount of greenhouse gases and various other identified pollutants, NOx and SOx, nitrous oxides and our sulfates that we release into the air. And for that, it's not really a measurable experimental thing. It's more of a calculation. We take the amount of, for example, diesel fuel that we burn on site, and then put that volume into a calculation, and that will inform us of the amount of greenhouse gases that we generate and the amount of NOx and SOx gases, for example. Here's an air graph depicting our air emissions against our derived regulatory limit in response to, I guess, radioactivity. You'll notice that much like the liquid effluent, we're well below the threshold that we're permitted. And we've been under for a number of years. This slide is depicting, I guess, the greenhouse gas reductions that have occurred over the site. You'll notice that back in 2009, we were producing a substantially larger amount of greenhouse gases. The primary reason for this was our site used to be heated with #2 heating oil from a centralized plant. I sort of mentioned back with the active liquid waste treatment system, we've gone more to a localized systems for each building instead of having a centralized system. And to do that, what we did was install electric boilers in a number of the buildings on site. And this enabled for buildings to be decommissioned one at a time instead of relying on interconnected centralized system. And what you're seeing is the transition from, I guess, #2 heating oil to electric heat for our remaining buildings. I'll now go into the environmental monitoring portion of our program. Environmental monitoring is essentially taking the effluent verification monitoring program data and then is incorporating the dose that the member of the public is expected to receive through our emissions through operation. In the figure, you'll see the scope of our program. We have monitoring locations going all the way from Great Falls Dam all the way to the town of Pinawa. The town of Pinawa is primarily our upstream background monitoring locations. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the various types of samples that we're obtaining and looking at for radioactivity. In the next couple of slides, it breaks down the various environmental components and the various sampling locations that our program has and highlights the parameters that we're looking for and informs everyone on the frequency in which they're being collected. Just give you a moment to give them a quick scan through. And on this slide, it's primarily focusing on the ones that are required to happen on a more frequent basis, whether it be weekly or a monthly sampling frequency. And then on the next slide, if we switch to it, you'll notice more of the annual types of sampling programs that we have incorporated on our site. You can see the various sampling. We're looking at the various water that the communities will be consuming. We're looking at the soil that they'll be potentially using to cultivate vegetables or just building their house upon. We're looking at the vegetation and whether or not radioactivity, or if there's any signs of radioactivity accumulating in the vegetation. And we're also looking at wildlife to see whether or not if any of the radioactivity is accumulating in their flesh and bones. Just to expand upon our fish monitoring program, each year we try to not only collect fish that rely on plant vegetation that's growing on the bottom, but we're also looking on your secondary consumers that eat these smaller fish. Once a year, typically in October, when most of the boat traffic on the Winnipeg River has dissipated and there's a better chance of survival for the fish when we net them. We go out and collect a number of fish from 3 locations, 1 upstream and 2 downstream from our plant site. And we look at their flesh for the amounts of radioactivity being captured in it. Likewise, we also have a garden crop monitoring program. We go to the local farmers markets or ask members of the public to provide us with garden crops that they've grown and analyze that for radioactivity to see if there's any bioaccumulation occurring, whether it be through the soil or through the water that they use to irrigate their crops. And then we're also doing natural types of vegetation on our site and in the vicinity. And we're looking at such things as mushrooms and wild rice and wild berries that the general population may be collecting in the vicinity of the Whiteshell site. Just to give you a little information on our wildlife program, it's primarily focused on analyzing roadkill that would be consumed by the general populace. The species that we typically collect and analyze for radioactivity are deer, bear, and grouse. For this program, we require approximately about 1 kilogram of flesh in order to submit it for radioactive analysis. And that limits us into the types of animals that we're capable of looking at. We also look at strontium-90, which tends to accumulate in the bones of various organisms. So we also collect the bones from these animals and submit a portion of their bone for radioactive analysis as well. This table just highlights the expected dose a member of the public would be receiving through these various pathways resulting from our operations. As you can see, we're a incredibly small fraction of the permitted 1 millisievert per year dose. And just to give you an idea of what the dose we're reporting to the public is equivalent to, there's this depiction on this slide of a number of common activities that would expose a member of the public to radiation. As you can see, taking one of the smaller ones on site, a dental x-ray, you're receiving less of a dose from our site operations than you would receive from a dental x-ray if you were to get one. Another prime example that we like to use is if you take a typical cross Canada flight, you would be exposed to 0.02 millisieverts. And again, you're receiving a much smaller dose from the operations of our site. Going on to the last major component of our environmental protection program, it's focusing on the groundwater monitoring plan that we have in place on site. The groundwater monitoring plan is primarily established around our waste storage facilities. We've currently identified 4 possible locations: the Lagoon, the landfill, our waste management area, and then we've started to implement a groundwater monitoring program on the main campus, and that is being done for the possible entombment of the WR1 reactor. We're currently in the process of getting our background information. In this slide, you can get an idea of the amount of groundwater monitoring wells we have and their locations. You can see the abundance of wells located around our waste management area. Just due to the nature of the materials being stored in that area, explains the abundance of wells that we have. Each of the bunkers or standpipes have wells associated with them to ensure that their structural and integrity is being maintained, and provide us an early warning system when those structures are starting to fail. The whole idea of our environmental or our groundwater monitoring program is to provide us early indication when those structures are starting to break down, and allow us to react. We expect to see the tritium, which typically is associated with the water flow, being the first parameter to be observed in our groundwater monitoring program if the structure was starting to fail. Following that, you'll get the strontium 90 and then the cesium isotopes being detected in the groundwater. Likewise, we have groundwater monitoring wells located around our landfill and our lagoon. Similar concept. They're there to ensure that the structural integrity of the facility is being maintained and allowing us to react earlier if we do notice contaminants starting to appear in the groundwater. This slide is depicting, I guess, the groundwater monitoring wells that we currently have in place, located around the main campus. Sites 1, 2, and 3 are going to be our upstream background wells, and then 4 through 8 are in the direct pathway of the groundwater flow to the Winnipeg River that we have established, and will hopefully provide us early warning of any contaminants that are seeping into the groundwater. Just to align with the other tables that we've presented, this table tells us the various locations and the parameters that we're looking for in our groundwater sampling campaigns, and the sampling frequency at which our groundwater is collected. Twice a year, typically in spring and fall. I'll now hand it over to Leslie Wilson, and she'll be discussing our biodiversity monitoring that occurs on site.
Thanks, Ryan. So all of the biodiversity monitoring that we do on site is passive acoustic monitoring. So we don't do handling or tagging of wildlife that some people might be familiar with. It's all passive acoustic monitoring. And I have at the top of the slide some of the typical things that we've done in the past. So monitoring for bats and songbirds on the main campus. We do an annual nest identification of all the buildings on the site, looking for nests that we have, what species we have nesting on our facilities. We do a regular species at risk habitat check, and any road mortalities are reported to environmental protection. So, and actually any sightings, we really encourage staff to report to us what wildlife they see on the site, and we mark that down and track that. The past season, we did a bat exit survey and an internal summer roost check of the WR1. So the main purpose there was to ensure to check and see if we have any bats roosting in the WR1 facility before that's decommissioned. So we had quite a bit of Indigenous participation in the bat exit survey this year, which was great. And we also did a turtle survey or search along all of our roads that we have on site. So the main plant road coming in and the WMA road, as well as the Lagoon road and the road out to the landfill. Tree roosting survey and a songbird survey were also done in an area where we're looking at putting a potential borrow pit to have additional clay to fill in to decommissioned building footprints. And again, we did our nest identification. That's business as usual for sure on the site, wanting to have a good idea of what species are nesting on buildings, because as we remove buildings on site, some birds really prefer to nest on man-made structures. So we want to make sure we're just keeping keeping the impacts to migratory birds and species at risk as low as possible. And I mentioned that we had some Indigenous participation in environmental monitoring. So I just put up on the screen here what kind of participation we had in the 2021 season for monitoring actually across the site. Not just in our biodiversity monitoring program, but in some of the monitoring that Ryan has mentioned. So river sediment, soil and vegetation sampling, we had Indigenous participation there, mushroom sampling, and then, as I mentioned, our turtle and songbird survey and groundwater monitoring in June, we had Indigenous participation there, and as I mentioned, the bat exit survey of WR1 in June and July. And hopefully we can have more Indigenous participation in the future and more collaboration with the governments and citizens that were out to help us with those activities. And just one last thing before we move into the question period. A lot of people think of us as a monitoring body, of which of course we are, but we're also heavy on the compliance end. And so when we go out and inspect sites, we have the authority to stop work if required, right? If we're not happy with what we see from an environmental regulation point of view, or from an environmental requirements point of view, we have the ability to stop work on job sites. So some of the things that we're looking at are sediment control. We place wind restrictions on projects. We look at the potential effects on migratory birds and species at risk. We're interested in archaeological artifacts. How waste is being segregated is a big one for us. So we're always encouraging recycling on job sites, chemical use and how it's stored, backfilling requirements, placement of excavated materials. We're always interested in wastewater and runoff handling, and dig limits and dust control. Those are just some of the examples that I wanted to share in this general slide with you. But yeah, that brings us to questions. So if there's any questions out there.
Thanks. Thanks, Leslie, and thanks, Ryan, for that very informative presentation on the Whiteshell Closure Project's environmental monitoring program. Lots of great information in there, and I know I learned a few things, and I'm hopeful that others on the line have as well, and hopefully we have some questions. We do have a question that came early on, and actually, if we want to scroll back, Leslie, in the presentation, there's a map that kind of shows the boundaries, and someone was just
Okay.
asking about what the linear feature. Teresa McLennan was asking what the linear feature running almost due east from the eastern boundary of the site on the photo is.
Okay, let me go back. Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay. So Mitch, it was, sorry,
Yeah.
the feature due east of the boundary?
So running along almost due east from the eastern boundary of the site on the photo showing the overall site. Yeah. So if we're looking east,
Mm-hmm.
the feature running almost due east. Is it a road? Is that the road?
You know what, yeah, it looks like a road. I'm not quite familiar with
I
that
think,
just because it's outside of our site boundary.
is that the Pinawa landfill? I think it is, right? Correct? Yes.
It's a possibility that it's the landfill. We will need to confirm that though.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, someone just said the linear feature is the road to the Pinawa landfill. That's correct. Okay. And then the little square. Yeah. Got it. Thanks, Jason. I believe that's Jason Martino. Nice to see you online, Jason. Okay. Do we have any other questions coming in? I see some questions came in, but they were answered throughout the presentation. Does CNL monitor the water in downstream locations? I do believe that was answered as part of your presentation there, Ryan.
Yeah, just to reiterate, yes, CNL collects water samples not only from the Pinawa water treatment facility, but we also do it at the Lactabani water treatment facility, and we also collect water samples from the Great Falls Dam.
Thank you. And then again, I think we saw this during the presentation, but again, we can reiterate, how do you conduct your environmental tests?
That's a loaded question. It depends on the type of sample that we're talking about. Typically with water, we collect approximately 40 liters from each of the locations that I mentioned before. We concentrate that water, evaporate it into a residue, and then we then submit the residue, which then gets turned into an ash for radioactive counting. That will provide us our environmental results that we actually report to. They're our most sensitive analysis that allow us to have the lowest detection limit. But we also have weekly screening data for our water samples based on 1 liter samples that we collect from our outfall discharge pipe. And we use that to provide us an indication whether or not the daily operations are having an impact and whether or not we need to take action in order to address a situation that is being detrimental to the environment instead of waiting until we get our monthly results in. If there's a specific sample that they want discussed in detail a little more, I'm happy to elaborate on.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Another one, and I think, again, you covered this during your presentation, but maybe we can reiterate. What protocols does CNL use to make sure they don't exceed the release limit?
I sort of mentioned it in my response to the previous question. On a monthly basis, we have those concentrated water samples that we report to the regulator. In the meantime, we have the weekly screening samples that we analyze for. They'll enable us to respond to a situation prior to our monthly limits being achieved, whether it be through the weekly analysis of our outfall samples or our air effluent monitoring is occurring on a weekly basis. We also have demolition air monitors set up around the main campus that are collected on a daily basis. And when we bring them into our sample management office, they're getting field screened to see if there's any activity on the filters that is at an alarming level that warrants expedited analysis of the filters. So yeah, we have our monthly monitoring that produces the reportable super sensitive results, but in the meantime, we rely on the weekly monitoring to provide us a rough estimate of the amount of activity that we're releasing on an ongoing basis.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. All right, another question in from Al. Your annual species testing is impressive, as are the results. I'm wondering if there would be any advantage to sampling longer lived species for long-term accumulation, such as snapping turtles or coniferous and deciduous trees.
There would definitely be an advantage. The longer living the organism is, the more opportunity there is for accumulation. The problem with snapping turtles, first of all, they're endangered species, so we don't want to actively pursue capture and the killing of snapping turtles. And the issue with the trees, trees are typically not being consumed by the general public, so it's not going to be incorporated into their dose exposure, hence why we're not looking at the trees at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. And then a final question here. You mentioned species at risk during your presentation. Has there been any species at risk found on the site? I don't know if Leslie wants to answer that one, or Ryan, whoever.
Yeah, you know, we're well aware that the snapping turtle, that's as Ryan mentioned, that's a species at risk that's found on our site. Another common species at risk that's found on our site is the barn swallow, and barn swallows nest typically on man-made structures. That's their first choice for nesting. So we have to be very careful with our decommissioning projects, you know, making sure that we, before the nesting season, we're blocking off areas that we know will be decommissioned in the migratory bird season. And that's actually one of the reasons why we put up some compensatory habitat on the site for barn swallows. We have 2 little shelters for barn swallows on our site. Yeah, those are the 2 sort of biggest finds on our site in terms of species at risk. But we do have a number of other bird species. We actually do a species at risk course for the staff that work outdoors or may come in contact with a species at risk. And we go through all the species on site, birds, turtles, bats. We have a couple of species at risk bats as well on our site. Just to educate them on what they might come across and what precautions need to be taken to protect those species at risk. So in that booklet, I'd say we cover just over 30 species at risk, and most of them are bird species. But yeah, basically the two most common ones that we see around are snapping turtles and barn swallows. I hope
Thank
that
you,
answers
Leslie.
the question. Yeah, no problem.
Yes. Okay, we're all out of questions, and we're butting up right against the end of the session here today. So I'd just like to take a moment and thank both Ryan and Leslie for spending some time with us today online here at this webinar. It was very informative, so thank you very much. And I also want to thank all our attendees and participants. Thank you for spending time with us today and learning about the Environmental Protection Program at Whiteshell. We certainly appreciate it. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate your questions. And as I mentioned, this will be going up on our YouTube page in both official languages in the next couple of days. So please feel free to share it. As well, if you have any questions that come to you or information needs that you think of over the next little while or at any time, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we'd be happy to work with you to get you the answer or the information you need. But once again, thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, yes.
Thank you, Mitch. Thanks everyone for joining.
Yes, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye for now.